Okay, so we're starting. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of Tel Aviv University. As you can see, people are at home, and some of us are in the office, but all of us are here as Tau family. As I said last time, we are here to present a very, very exciting webinar. The university really in these days are working really, really hard on different aspects. One of them, of course, is the online learning that all our professors are engaged in really saving the semester for the students. And of course, from the other side, we have over 15 labs in the university that are working on the corona issue, if it's detection or if it's vaccine. And really 24/7, our scientists are working on, again, trying to find a solution for all of us and for humanity. Of course, it's not only for Israel or Tel Aviv, it's for humanity. So again, of course, we will send you updates. But today we have a different webinar, another exciting one, because we are such an interdisciplinary university, this panel is really combined of amazing researchers. And we're excited that we can touch also on the legal, technology, and other social aspects of this situation we are all in. So again, I know that our team and Ayana that is working very hard on this, and with the American friends here, Kelly, and the staff that is working hard on enabling each one of us, and Ross that is managing the online. This is the place to thank you, and we will continue with other exciting and really important webinars. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Yael Sternhell. And one second, okay, can you hear me? Yes. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Yael Sternhell. She's from the Zvi Yavets historical school, and she's an amazing expert on many other fields. Of course, she can describe it. She's going to be our moderator today. So, Dr. Sternhell, please, the floor is yours. Unmute. You have to unmute yourself. Yael, unmute.
I was told to mute, so now it's time to unmute. Hi, thank you, Amos, for this introduction. I study the 19th century, and I study very different things. I literally have nothing to contribute to the corona research, sadly. So that's why I'm here as moderator. We're all really delighted to be here and hope you are all safe and sane in the midst of this global upheaval. And we do have three of Tel Aviv University's best and brightest minds today with us to talk about different aspects of the pandemic. I'll introduce them briefly right now, and then we will get the conversation going. So Professor Michael Birnhack is Associate Dean for Research at the Buchman Faculty of Law at Tel Aviv University, where he is also the director of the Parasol International LLM program and the director of the S. Horowitz Institute for Intellectual Property. Michael's research focuses on information technology law, especially privacy and intellectual property. Recently, he won the Zeltner Prize for Excellence in Legal Research. Congratulations. And even more recently, and more pertinently, he has advised the Israeli Ministry of Health on privacy aspects of its Shield app applied in the context of the current epidemic. Professor Hila Shamir teaches at the Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law as well. Hila teaches and researches in the field of employment, labor, immigration, and welfare law, with a focus on issues of labor trafficking as well as gender equality. In 2018, Hila received the highly prestigious European Research Council grant for a project taking a labor approach to human trafficking and established the TrafLab research group. At TrafLab, an interdisciplinary group of scholars and lawyers are researching various labor-based tools to transform the structures that enable severe forms of labor market exploitation in a global economy. Dr. Dan Yamin is a faculty member at the Department of Industrial Engineering at Tel Aviv and a former faculty member in the Center of Infectious Disease Modeling and Analysis at Yael. Dr. Yamin's work has contributed to impact health policy against influenza in Israel, offered novel strategies to eliminate Ebola in the recent outbreak in Liberia, and recently developed a model offering new vaccination strategies against a certain respiratory virus, which I will not attempt to pronounce. A vaccine that is currently being examined by a world-leading vaccination company. Dr. Yamin has consulted for two important vaccination companies and has also been the recipient of several prizes for both his teaching and his research. So Dan, why don't we start with you, because your lab really is in the thick of it, employing cutting-edge technologies to confront the spread of the virus. So tell us a little bit about the work you are currently involved in, and namely, how do you use mathematical models to predict and then prevent the spread of disease?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. So we are currently focusing on two major projects. The first is on a macro level, where we try to provide guidelines of how should we return life to normal. And obviously, we understand it has to be gradual. And we have to balance between the great fear of that will lead to a crisis in the hospitals, and obviously the major concern we have to the economy. And what we try to address is to basically provide a framework of how to do that. Who should be targeted first? Who can return to normal life first? Would it be the school-age children? Would it be young children, maybe working adults? Should we do it in a more localized way in specific regions or not? How do we know that we did not make a mistake? What are the measures we have to take in order to make sure that we will not eventually lead to the crisis in the hospitals? So these are the kind of questions that we try to address. This is the first macro project that is conducted in collaboration with my friend and colleague, Professor Irad Bengal, also here from the Faculty of Engineering. The second work that we're trying to do is by understanding that elderly are at the greatest risk to develop complications of the disease. What we try to do is provide, we start with 200 and hopefully we'll reach to 500 or 700 individuals that will download, elderly individuals that we will download an application, a designated application we developed, and we will provide them a wearable like this. And what we try to do is to utilize the data collected and the transmission models in order to detect as early as we can, a possible coronavirus infection. And this is obviously important from two aspects. The first is early detection means early treatment or early supportive treatment currently. And obviously early treatment and early isolation means that we prevent transmission. So these are the two major projects that we are currently focusing. How do we do that? So roughly speaking, when we're talking about transmission models, when we're talking about transmission of infectious disease, it is mainly arises by three components. The first is the pathogen. So we have to improve our understanding about the biological assumptions, and we obviously read the most updated literature to understand this component. The second is the social behavior, is the individuals. So what we're doing is trying to utilize various sources of data, including mobile aggregated data of mobile phones that is related to individual. That based on them we can see what are the mixing patterns of individuals and how responsive they are to the request of the government. And the third component, so I said pathogen, I said the individuals, and the third is the decision makers. And obviously the three affect each other in a very dynamic, complex, and interesting way. By taking into consideration these three components and integrating various sources of data that are related to health and non-health, technological data, we try to develop these models. And then the second step is to simulate, to use some computerized simulations in order to understand the patterns, understand transmission, and predict what would happen if we apply certain forms of interventions.
Right. So is this the kind of modeling that you used in your work in preventing the spread of the Ebola epidemic in Liberia? And what can you tell us about the experience you accumulated there that is now informing your work on the coronavirus?
Okay, so I should say yes and no. I'll start with the no. No, because of course we are not speaking, Liberia is a different setting. We're talking about a developing country. There's a lot of uncertainty that was related to the disease and to the social behavior there. But I would say yes, also because we're talking about human behavior, and the human behavior seem to highly affect or to be the most important component in understanding the spread of the disease. And what I learned personally from my previous experience from Ebola, and actually see it now as a flashback, I see a lot of similarities, is that with no cliche, we have to be humble and we have to understand that the community, the population, is not part of the problem, it's part of the solution. So in Liberia at first, there were a lot of mistrust between the government and the population. And because of that, the government, the policymakers there decided that they have to do some specific actions that even increase the distrust. For example, they had to bury the bodies in a secret place. They didn't tell anyone in order to prevent transmission. This actually led to a spike in transmission. And then they realized that maybe the best way is to be humble, to talk with the head of the tribes. And actually, they invited the head of the tribes to sit down in the same place and discuss and see how they can be helpful, and not try to educate, but try to see how together, collaboratively, they can find a solution. And this was quite amazing, because I think that was the key, actually retrospectively, that's what I believe most scientists believe, that was the main reason why Liberia was the hardest hit, but they had the fastest decline. And the same happens here in Israel. There are some communities in Israel that, for example, the ultra-Orthodox, that seem to be less responsive with the government request. And I think the best way to approach them would be to talk to them in the way, not to try to educate them, to try to understand their needs, to understand their problem, and to try to find a framework, a designated framework for them. And unfortunately, we see that a lot of some populations in Israel have accused the others. And instead of, the Kol Israel Chaverim, I genuinely believe that that is the key for solution. It's not a cliche. It worked in Liberia, and I'm certain it's going to work in here.
Right. So it's really interesting to hear a scientist working with mathematical models at the end of the day, talking about the fact that human beings need to somehow be able to communicate with one another. And I'm not sure that's, that's a dynamic that any mathematical model can predict or calculate, right? I mean, there's a real tension here between the fact that you can model all sorts of scenarios, but at the end of the day, different populations just react very differently to these conditions.
This is true, but we have technology, and we know, and even aggregated technology. We can see about the mixing patterns of individuals. We see how some populations are less responsive, more responsive, where they mix, how they go. And that is why we can have good predictions. Now, obviously, at the beginning, there is a very wide uncertainty. And because of that, if you're humble and you account for the uncertainty, you should provide decision makers this uncertainty, because the outcomes will have a high variance. And you should discuss about this, and you should tell the policymakers, okay, this is the probability from our analysis, this is the probability that if you act this way, that's what is going to happen. Now, the moment you do it, you can generate policies that should be applied and that can be helpful.
Okay.
So that is the way.
All right, thank you. That's super interesting. So Michael, I want to move to you now, and you're obviously a privacy specialist, and privacy has been a very urgent concern now for a long time, and increasingly an urgent concern for basically anyone who's, you know, on the grid. And I'm wondering whether we are still allowed to be concerned about privacy at a moment when we're told you either choose privacy or you choose public health. It's either your privacy or your parents' life. So how do you?
Right. So hi everybody. I updated a presentation that I had, which was entitled "Privacy Challenges." I deleted challenges and I wrote instead "in crisis." And privacy, like many other human rights, by the way, in times of crisis, are themselves in crisis. Because as you said, you know, it's very tempting to pose this situation as a binary one of privacy on the one hand, or human life on the other hand, and, you know, forget about privacy, who cares about it? Our mission is to save lives. However, I do genuinely believe that we can and we should, and we owe it to ourselves as individuals and as a society to have both. And I think it is possible to have both, you know, to fight the pandemic as much as we can and hope that it will disappear as soon as we can, and to preserve human rights. This is a time in which, in particular, we need human rights. You know, in regular times, to stand at the middle of the town square and, you know, protest and say, we need more budgets for the health industry and hospitals, etc. I don't really need the legal protection of my freedom of expression. Nobody will locate my whereabouts, etc. But in times of crisis, we must preserve our human rights. And the question is not if, but how. And I believe there are some ways to do that, privacy by design, and I'm happy to go into details. But I would like to build on what Dan has just said before. I believe that the key is trust, and the public's trust in what is going on and in whoever is managing this crisis, the government or whoever is in charge or trying to be in charge in some cases of this. If we do not trust those who try to manage this crisis, we will not cooperate. Some of us might even resist, and the results might be even worse than anything else. And in finding the way of how to have both privacy and advancing the crucial public health interests, we should remember this issue and take it into consideration.
So, but how do we trust them? I mean, you know, especially in Israel, of course, every country has its own, you know, this is on the one hand, and we'll touch on this in a moment with Hila, it's a global crisis, but every country reacts differently, and suddenly the country in which you live in makes a tremendous difference in a way that often it doesn't feel like it does in a kind of in a globalized world. But at least here in Israel, you know, where we have good reason to be, you know, at the very least skeptical or cautious about our very powerful security services. Yeah. So how do we make ourselves trust them when we're being told that, you know, from now on, it's the the all-powerful security service, the Shin Bet, is tracking our every move to see whether we have corona and whether we violated our quarantine terms?
Right. So the Israeli government, the Ministry of Health, and I don't accuse them of that. They are working like their colleagues in other countries under huge pressure, to handle this uncontrolled epidemic. And they have chosen two parallel paths, which I think contradict each other exactly at the point of public trust and solidarity. On the one hand, the use of the General Security Services, the Shin Bet, and on the other hand, launching an app that the Shield, Hamagen, to which I happily advised the Ministry of Health on the privacy aspects. And at the same time, personally, I publicly opposed the first channel of using the security services. So Israel, to the best of my knowledge, at present, is the only democratic country in the world that has used its security service to spy on its citizens in the context of the coronavirus epidemic. And this was a big surprise to many of us, including, by the way, to those in the government who are in charge of privacy. They, so I believe, just like us, have learned about the use of the security service from television. They saw the Prime Minister announce that a few weeks.
That's comforting.
Sorry?
That's comforting.
Well, yeah. And as many of our listeners and viewers may know, the Israeli government has issued exactly 2 weeks ago, emergency regulations which allowed and authorized the Shin Bet, the General Security Service, to collect and process data, which apparently they already have about Israeli citizens, and transfer this data to the Ministry of Health. And this is for important reasons, by the way. The needs, there are acute informational needs here. First, if a person is diagnosed as suffering from corona, there's an epidemiological inquiry, and we would like to learn where this person has been in the past 2 weeks. So, and many people, are happy to share that information, but they, where exactly was I 11 days ago at 9 a.m.? God knows. Who did I meet? Maybe I know because it's family or colleagues or friends, but maybe some strangers. So we need information that can help us reconstruct the sick people's whereabouts in the past 2 weeks. Then we need to find out who crossed their paths and might have been infected. And then we need to inform them. So these are really important informational needs, but using the Shin Bet, the security services, I believe, undermines public trust. And we saw that a week later, when the Ministry of Health launched an application. Everybody can download it, and I recommend Israelis at least downloading that again. And it tries to answer the same needs, but in a different way. First, if you don't want to, you don't have to. So it's voluntary and it's consent. It records our whereabouts in intervals of 14 days as of the time we download the application. The data is retained locally on our phones. It is not transferred to the Ministry of Health. If I'm fed up with it, I can delete it. The Ministry of Health then pushes information encrypted into our phones about the whereabouts of sick people. And if there's a match, we will be informed and instructed what we should do. This is a privacy enhancing technology, privacy by design solution, a solution that does preserve public trust. But when you compare this to the parallel route of using the security service, well, many people did raise an eyebrow, and say, you sent the security services to spy on me, and now you're asking me to voluntarily download this app. There's a problem there.
Right, which means that the public is not that cooperative, which goes back to Dan's point that you can't beat this unless the public trusts the leadership and is willing to go along with whatever, certain initiatives, certain policies that are not that comfortable. one more question that comes to mind, Michael, do you think that in the wake of this, public response would be to just kind of accept the fact, now that we found out that the security service can track us down, at any, maybe we should all have known this all along, but we didn't, or at least we didn't want to know it. But now that we know it, are we going to get used to it? Or can you also think of a kind of a counter reaction of people actually saying, you know what, this is where I draw the line, and the kind of life that we live now of total connectivity is just not worth the price of being exposed like this?
Great. So, this is one of my concerns. I'm not a physician, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm concerned with the day after. I'm also concerned with what's happening now, but this is beyond, my control, obviously. I'm concerned what will happen to our society and the entire human race, basically, in the day after Corona is gone. And my concern is that Corona will be gone, but many of the measures that we see now, the surveillance measure, bulk surveillance, will stay. To a great extent, many of my colleagues in the privacy circles around the world, we have been comparing what's going on now in Israel and in other countries to 9/11. After 9/11, there were obviously various security needs, and they were met to some extent in different countries in different ways. But many of those measures meant to deal with, very specific kinds of terrorism, were, kept on going until Snowden revealed whatever he revealed, and presumably it continues in some countries. And that is a major concern. And some people, will try to get away with that and to get away from it, but difficult, impossible.
Impossible, in fact. Okay, thank you. Folks in the audience, I can see the questions coming in, and we will get to them. I think Barbara, Michael just answered your question about what is the Hamagen application, which is just a better way of tracking down civilians and letting them know that they were or may have been exposed to Corona without involving the security service and without using this information for any other purpose. So I hope Michael explained this in enough detail. And Hila, I'd like to move to your set of questions or topics. And among the more apocalyptically minded, there is a sense that the coronavirus will end globalization as we know it. I mean, the sense that suddenly it matters whether you live in a country which can manufacture toilet paper is never, that's never going to go away, right? The sense that people need to be dependent on local resources, local policies, and that the illusion that we lived under has somehow come to a rather sudden and bitter end. Do you share this sense?
So I think, definitely the coronavirus is shaping up to be an enormous challenge or a form of a stress test for globalization. But I do not believe it ended it. Globalization, as we know, it didn't end, though it may end up transforming it a little bit. So let me explain what I mean by transforming it and in what way. But first, when we talk about globalization, we're really talking about various elements that relate to the interconnected global economy that we live in. And I think, especially when we're talking about Corona, we can talk about three elements. One would be the modes and patterns of production, and specifically what is known as supply chain capitalism, the global network of production and consumption processes. So that's kind of one thing that has been impacted by Corona. The second is the issue of borders, right? What does it mean? What do borders mean now after Corona, the closure, the openness? And the third is the role of the nation state versus the global community. So it's the same globalization that allowed for the rapid spread of contagious disease that also created this deep economic interdependence between countries. And this interdependence is now turning out to be a source of vulnerability, as you said with the example of the toilet paper, right? But maybe more, many people have been extremely worried about medical masks as well as an issue. And I'll get back to that example. So so it became this interdependence kind of turned into a source of vulnerability that in some sectors really brought global production almost to a halt, right? A very scary thing that happened to many of us, to all of us. So while this global interconnectedness was thought of before the virus as kind of almost as an unstoppable force of nature, now we see that it's more fragile than we thought. So if we look at supply chains, we suddenly came to realize that the deep dependence of the world on China as a source of production created this immense vulnerability to countries, to corporations, but also to individual consumers when Chinese producers could no longer produce and export their goods. Now, this may lead, I think, to diversification of sourcing in production networks, but not necessarily to ending global supply chains and reverting to local ones. The rationale behind global supply chains wasn't impacted by the pandemic, but it will probably impact sourcing and production practices, and maybe even return something that was kind of a long lost concept, which is the warehouse, right? Just having extra, something that corporations almost no longer do in their economic rationale. It's a waste. And so I think now suddenly the idea of maybe if we had a warehouse of these things somewhere, it would have been better. That's if we look at supply chains. If we look at borders, again, we see the almost unthinkable happening. The EU closing borders, the EU countries closing borders one after the other in an attempt to protect themselves from outsiders. Now, who are these outsiders? These are no longer people from outside the EU, which is what we were kind of used to in the refugee crisis. Rather, these are people from inside the EU, from different individual countries within the EU. So we see this breakdown not just in borders, but also in relation to the notion of a single market, right? With unrestricted free trade among member states. Now, in these desperate times, what we see is that governments, such as the French government, seized all medical masks, right? In Germany, prohibited the export of medical masks and respirators outside of Germany, right? So no longer a single market. Each country is spending on its own.
Which is also, Hila, interestingly enough, a matter of trust, right? I mean, how do you return to trusting a different country that during a pandemic denied you its extra medical masks? How do you return to a level of trust that enables commerce in a kind of fair and workable way?
Well, of course, it's in relation to supply chains. It's always the question whether commerce was fair and equitable, right? And actually, we see here changing power dynamics with countries that can produce and countries that cannot produce. We see Russia and Turkey becoming very powerful because Turkey does produce a lot of these elements, especially medical masks, for example. So, we do see some interesting elements here. But I think the question of trust is something that I definitely do not know how to answer, and we'll have to see what happens to the EU after, and whether we'll go back to business as usual. I do want to say one more thing about this trust that you're talking about, because you're talking about global trust, but what we see here is national trust. We see people turning to their own governments and asking them for assistance and help, and really demanding a return of a welfare state to an extent that we're kind of almost forgot about. And the idea that the people you should trust and can't trust or the institutions are your nation state institutions. So, in Europe, you can think of other regional neighbors, really physical neighbors who no longer have the same situation because they're in different countries, right? They're in different locales. So not locales, but different nation states. So I think the centrality of the state to this crisis is extremely striking, and also brings back the issue of trust. Let me just say one more thing in relation to this, that what I talked about here so far is kind of the crumbling of this globalization, but I do want to say that look at us now, right? Sitting here from different countries, And of course, this could have happened before Corona. And sometimes it did, but it seems that more often it didn't, that it happens more now, that people actually use Zoom and say, oh, well, you know, I can't travel there. I can't be expected to travel. So how about we just Zoom in, right? So, and at Tau, we're now opening Zoom classes globally. And for example, in our workshops at the law school, we suddenly have PhD students and scholars from all around the globe joining the conversation in a way that we never even imagined of doing several weeks ago.
Right. It's so interesting because, right, the technology done was there, but we just didn't.
We didn't use it in the same.
Not how we do things, right? I mean, kind of that was the notion.
Exactly. So I do think, you know, we do need to see the tensions here in relation to what's happening, and the pandemic kind of brought us closer in some ways, and of course further apart in others. And so I think these are kind of the tensions that we'll have to look at when we're thinking about the impact of globalization, both at a nation state level, a global level, but also kind of in a subject position of the individual and their place on this planet, on this earth that we share.
Yeah, no, there is it's an existential crisis. I mean, let's be honest. I mean, so much of, you know, the way we lived our lives has kind of come to this screeching halt. I mean, hopefully just for a few weeks, but it's an experience that will not be soon forgotten, which leads me to my next question about the world of work. And like privacy, the transformation in the world of work has been on the agenda for years now, and undergoing slow change. And suddenly the slow change has become incredibly fast change, you know, in the same way that the university has changed in a couple of weeks, so has the world of work. And, you know, in the same way that we think about what will privacy look like the day after, how will the world of work look at the day when we're all allowed to go to the office again?
So, you know, that's a really, really important question to ask now. And it's important to kind of contextualize this, because, you know, several weeks ago, before Corona, really one of the trendiest topics among labor scholars was what is called the future of work, right? Scholars were talking about the end of work as we know it. The idea was that technology and automatization will make many jobs unnecessary, leaving many in the developed and maybe in the developing world jobless. Now, this was a lively field of debate with conferences, reports, articles, people saying whether this will happen and will not happen. And some of these darkest predictions suddenly happened overnight, right? Suddenly, people are working from home. Many people do not have a job, huge job loss. A huge cut in the percentage of workers everywhere. And people, you know, rise of the gig economy, people trying to get any job they can without an employer-employee relationship. So it's all suddenly here with a vengeance. And of course, under very, very different conditions, mostly because of the quarantine that doesn't allow, you know, it's not business as usual, but still. And so Corona outcomes kind of reinvigorate some of the future of work debate that really ended up being about the distribution of responsibility between employers, governments, and individual workers, right? Who will pay for sick leave, for example, becomes a really important question. Right. Can employers afford it? Do you have an employer? I mean, who is your employer? And we're talking about how long should unemployment benefit be? Who can work from home? Who is a necessary worker and who isn't, right? And so all of these questions really go back to the distribution of labor between the government and market actors and individuals. And in regular times, the question of distribution of labor really depends on the kind of worker you are in the categories of, you know, worker versus independent contractor, unionized versus non-unionized workplace, direct employment versus subcontracting. So we have all of these around, and suddenly now all of these seem to be, you know, really reconsidered, because you know, whether you're you know, you're a subcontracted worker or an employee, of course you might have very different outcomes, but the government really needs to address you know, really needs to address your needs in a very similar way. So for example, we see again, of kind of an extreme example, but Harvard just last week declared that it's going to continue paying not only its employees, but also its subcontracted workers, which are maybe cleaners and security personnel.
But after it said it wouldn't, right? I mean, at first Harvard decided to kind of lay off anyone who was basically untenured, right? And then, you know, there was a public outcry. It's the wealthiest university in the world. And they kind of, you know, which shows that public opinion still matters even in the age of the coronavirus, which I find uplifting.
It definitely does. And we see that in various elements in the Israeli crisis as well. We're talking about remote schooling, remote education, and that happened in Israel as well. They stopped it and returned it. But you know, going back to the world of work, I think definitely when we recover from this crisis, hopefully soon, I think a lot of this will be changing in public policy. In the US, we see it already, that a lot of the new unemployment benefit in the new bills are actually not distinguishing between independent contractors and workers. That didn't yet happen in Israel, but I do hope that the Israeli government will take more action around this. And similarly, we see employers who can afford it taking responsibility for subcontracted workers. This again may linger on after, who knows? And definitely, I mean, two other issues, just to mention them, is the issue of, you know, working from home. You know, so many of us are working from home now. What does, you know, labor inspection, and both in terms of, you know, how do you know what your worker did during the day? You know, all of these issues your employee did are being now tried out and challenged, and seem to be more manageable than people, you know, used to say. Again, depending on industry, and this is a very wide generalization, but it's, you know, it's being done. The big challenge that we see now is work-life balance, right? Balancing family and work, especially when you work from home. And I think that is one of the issues that in the current crisis, we see no solution for. Not governmental, I mean, you can see many blogs and Facebook and Twitter filled with stuff about that, but we don't see policy responses to that.
You don't see the government. So, I mean, I think one of the really interesting issues that's kind of all-consuming, and that in some ways connects the threads between what you are all thinking about right now, is the re-entry of government into our lives in pretty spectacular ways. And I mean, Israel, you know, in Israel, government is usually pretty present in our lives in all sorts of ways, but not like this. I mean, not in the sense that you wait every evening to see what the prime minister is going to say to you about what, you know, tomorrow morning's routine is going to look like, right? And I think that's the relationship between citizens and governments. What do we owe each other? What kind of trust do we owe them? But what do they owe us at our moment of great distress, whether it's health-wise or economic-wise, is what, you know, it's one of the great questions that will arise out of this, in the same way that, by the way, it arose out of I mean, the best example that I can think of is an extreme example, but I think it's the closest one, and it's the World War II era. You know, the last time that governments and entire populations reconsidered the relationship between constituencies and their rulers was then with, you know, enormously consequential results.
Basically, the welfare state as we know it, right?
Exactly. The welfare state as we know it is a result of this reconsideration. So then, coming back to you, I mean, we're talking about the day after, and there's a question here that I want Michael to answer in a moment about surveillance the day after by Howard Herman, which we'll get to in a moment. But we speak rather optimistically about a day after. In Israel, it seems like it might be not that far off, right? Because things here feel under control. In the US, it doesn't feel under control, and it's not under control. And in other countries, it's just the epidemic is just getting off the ground, so to speak. But we also need to prepare for a second wave, right? I mean, this may not be a one-time thing in our lives. And the question is, does your mathematical modeling have any answers in terms of when, how bad, and how can we prepare for this?
Definitely. Well, it seems that in the near future, we're not going to have vaccination. And if there is no treatment, and assuming that the trend will be the same, so that there won't be mutations that will make the virus less extreme or less contagious, then that basically means more or less that about 50% of the population needs to become infected and then recovered until we'll get to the herd immunity. And now what we have to do is, by being aware of that, we have to think how to develop a strategy and how to try to, basically, that's what I said in our first talk, how to balance between the risk of hospital crisis to the risk of basically destroying the economy. Now, I think that there are some opportunities. As far as I know from all research that I've read, all previous coronaviruses were seasonal. And that provides us some kind of an opportunity. Where in the Northern Hemisphere, previous studies shown that there is a decline in May. Hopefully there will be a decline in May. That basically means that we can feel more confident to some extent, and we can check it and see that more and more people will return to normal. That means that more and more people will be infected and then recovered, and then we can have more groups to return to normal, infected and then recovered, and hopefully by then we will reach the winter with a situation where we have about 50% that already got infected. If we don't, we have to be very careful on that. If we don't, then we're going to return to the same situation with another problem, influenza virus, RSV, and other contagious diseases. And this is something that we have to take into consideration. So that is why we have to plan to have a strategy, because we cannot postpone our life forever. A steady state is a steady state. As far as we are now reaching or understanding that we 50% or in the same, we stay in the same situation, 50% more or less should be infected and then recovered until Corona will leave our lives. So this is something that we have to bear in mind.
Okay. So basically sending out people back to work and telling them, you know, go ahead, get infected. That's also a government policy, right? Essentially.
Definitely. So basically get immune. That's the way you can
require immunization. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. All right, a couple of questions to Michael, which have sort of popped up here in my Q&A window. One, which we've sort of touched on, but maybe, Michael, you want to address perhaps more globally, which is, will this surveillance system remain in place after the outbreak is over? Will it be reviewed by the parliament? Are we also expecting a ration card app to be installed anytime soon? And then also a question from Sharon, which apps are reliable? And it seems the ones are developed in Israel recently are not available outside of Israel on the App Store. Thank you. And keep safe, everyone. Thank you, Sharon. But Michael, can you make any recommendations for people here who are not in Israel for what?
So, sure. So thank you for these great questions. Many governments around the world are, you know, all governments are looking at other countries and governments to see what they are doing. The Israeli app by the Ministry of Government, amazingly, is open source. So software people, engineers, computer scientists can and they do look into that to search for bugs and make sure that data security is is kept, and that is okay as well. It has been reported, and the people at the Ministry of Health told me, Italy has approached the Israeli government and asked them, maybe too late, but asked them to use that for their purposes, and some other countries have also shown interest in the Israeli application. Other countries have developed their own applications. Notably, I would like to mention Singapore. Singapore has developed what they call the Trace Together application. You can look it online, it's available only there. Once again, it's a voluntary application, so if you don't want to use it, you don't have to use it. It does not trace location, but it does trace contacts. So if Yael and I, crossed paths in the street in Tel Aviv, the application will not know where, but it will know that we have met. And but none of us will know the identity of the other through the app at least. If, God forbid, one of us is sick, the other will be informed. So there are lots of design opportunities here, and different countries, they're all playing and looking at what other countries are doing about that. And I hope more governments adopt such applications which, try and solve the needs and to answer the needs and yet preserve privacy. Specifically about the other path, that of using the security services. There were emergency regulations, they expire tonight, but in the meantime, the government has approached the Knesset, which was not there 2 weeks ago, but now it is, and has sought a different legislative path. And there have been some discussions on Thursday in which I testified as well, Zoom-wise, to the Knesset, and there were some more discussions on yesterday and on Monday. And the Knesset has inserted various changes to what the government wants to do, but it seems it will continue at least for April, at least until the end of April at this point. There was another question, and with that I will end, about the EU and the GDPR, etc. The system of collecting information about our location and infected people and non-infected people's locations could be designed in endless ways. One option would be to approach the telecom, the mobile companies who do have our location, because it's part of how the cellular system works. It's part of its architecture. So the governments could have approached the mobile companies and demand or ask for that data, but then we run into lots of other privacy issues. In the EU, all of these are regulated under the GDPR. And that goes back to consent. The core principle of the GDPR is data subjects, that's us, the users, consumers, citizens, consent. If we have informed and free consent, many things, not everything, many things with our data can be okay. It can be kosher. So if there's a mobile provider who said, in times of crisis, we will do with the data so-and-so in order to save lives, that might be permitted. The GDPR does include various other legitimate bases for processing of personal data. It's complicated, goes into a lot of detail, but if that is the path chosen, I believe it can be done, but once again, with preserving privacy principles, and we can have both. It's not an either or. We can have both privacy and answer the public health needs.
Right, assuming that we have a government that's sensitive to these needs and respects them, and that is to each of us in our own country. Okay, we have still a bunch of questions here that we haven't answered, but we are going to start to wrap up. Hila, can you say one word, just one word, and I'm sorry to have you to restrict you to that, about the most vulnerable workers, the ones that you study, the ones who are not in their offices, right? The ones who are sex workers, migrant workers, the people who do the hard menial labor that middle-class global citizens are so used to. Do they have any chance of surviving this pandemic?
So as can be expected, the most vulnerable are now yet again the most vulnerable. This did not change. We do see, in very specific sectors, delivery people, gig economy workers who now have a lot of, a lot to do, but these are minuscule in relation to thinking about, care work, construction, sex work, agriculture, where we see a lot of the world's most vulnerable. So each of these, I will have something different to say about. It's difficult to sum it up in a minute, but I will say that what we do see here is a cry and a need and some recognition from governments that these populations require more protection because the situation is so dire. I mean, it's sad to say that it needs to reach such a low place in order for the government to pay attention. But definitely when we're talking about these populations, I think the only positive thing I can say is that maybe more policy attention will be paid to them because of their dire situation at the moment.
Well, I mean, I have to say that despite how dire things are for the most vulnerable, but also for the less vulnerable, even for those of us who do have a secure living and enjoy a full citizenship, a lot of what I'm getting out of my conversation here with you all is the fact that this may be also a transformative moment for the better in the relationship between citizenries and their governments. And this idea that trust matters. The government has to trust the public has to trust the government needs to take care of the citizenry needs to be able to follow some basic rules, and that if Michael says that it's possible in the realm of privacy, then maybe it's possible kind of in a larger sense, and maybe nation states will learn some productive lessons from this crisis. Okay, we're out of time, sadly. I could continue talking to you all for hours. So thank you everyone for joining us. Please stay healthy, follow the rules. There's no other way. I hope to see all three of you on campus three-dimensionally sooner rather than later, and to see all of you in some form, virtual or not, also sooner rather than later. And thank you, Amos. And that's it.
Yael, toda raba. Thank you.
My
Be
pleasure.
well, everyone. Thank you.
Happy holidays.
Thank you, everybody.
Toda raba. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.